Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Episodes. Tonight, we open a darker page of medieval history, one rarely sung in choirs, rarely painted on chapel walls. We are not speaking of kings or crusades. We are not counting relics or miracles. We are stepping into smaller rooms where whispers replace confession, where vows are both shield and sentence, and where the human heart learns how to ache in silence. This is not the story of saints in stained glass, but of medieval nuns, women hidden behind stone and ritual, whose secrets glimmer faintly through the dust of centuries. For inside every convent wall was a different kind of battle, one between body and spirit, faith and longing, prayer and the pulse beneath it. You are a daughter in the year 1312. Your father has debts. Your mother says this is God's will. The cart waits before dawn. You ride without looking back. The convent gates rise from the fog like a mouth about to close. When you enter, the sound of the world fades. A veil is placed on your head. Your hair falls to the floor. They call you Sister Agnes. They tell you you are chosen. But chosen rarely means free. The days inside feel endless. The bells divide them into prayers. The prayers divide them into silences. You learn to walk without sound, to smile without showing teeth, to breathe without wanting. Yet at night, when candles burn low, you feel something stirring, a warmth that defies scripture, a whisper that sounds too human to be divine. These walls were meant to protect holiness, but they also trapped hunger and the echoes of forbidden desire in convents that no vow could erase. If you wish to wander deeper into the medieval convent secrets, the quiet pages between faith and flesh, you're welcome to like or subscribe. Only if it rests your mind. Only if it helps the night settle. And if you'd like, leave a small hello in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and what hour it is there. It's strangely comforting to imagine a circle of listeners, scattered and silent, sharing the same dim candlelight of curiosity and memory. Dim your lights. Let the heart. Only the veil remains, a curtain between who you were and who you must now pretend to be. You tell yourself this is holy. You tell yourself this is peace, but peace feels too still, too quiet, too much like surrender. The candles flicker above you, their flames bowing in rhythm to the same air you breathe. Even faith, you think, seems tired tonight. And the story begins here, not in light, but in the long, soft dark, where even your faith learns how to tremble. Chapter 1. The Walls. The convents of medieval history were built to hold silence and to contain women who had too much of it. Their walls rose not from faith alone, but from debt, duty, and the slow machinery of power. Stone by stone, they reshaped the lives of daughters into something the church could name, own, and sanctify. A nobleman would build one to cleanse his conscience. A merchant would send a daughter to one to settle a tax. And for the poor, the convent was often a quieter grave, a place where hunger could be mistaken for holiness. The church said these walls were safety, that the world outside was temptation. But for many medieval nuns, the world inside became a subtler form of punishment, one wrapped in hymns, rituals, and perfect obedience. The foundations were thick and windowless. Sunlight entered only in slivers, as if heaven itself were allowed to visit for just a few careful minutes each day. When new sisters arrived, they were not welcomed as women, but erased as souls reborn. Their hair was cut, their names changed, and their voices surrendered to the rule of silence. They were told they were now brides of Christ, but it felt less like a wedding and more like a burial under the weight of devotion. Every convent was a world unto itself. Behind those walls lived the memory of hundreds of women who prayed, cleaned, copied manuscripts, and learned to live inside the rhythm of bells. There was a bell for prayer, a bell for confession, a bell for sleep, and a bell to remind them that everything in between also belonged to God. To outsiders, the convents looked serene, gardens trimmed, cloisters quiet, candles burning at even intervals like perfect hearts. But behind those doors, life pulsed differently. There were whispers beneath the chants, tears behind the veils, and sometimes laughter that had to hide behind prayer. Each wall had its own sound. Some heard the scratching of quills, women copying holy texts until their fingers bled. Others heard the dull rhythm of footsteps in endless procession. And sometimes, if you listened long enough, you could almost hear a sigh escape through the cracks. The sound of something still human, chosen her. But chosen rarely meant free. Fathers sent them away in silence. Mothers kissed them goodbye without meeting their eyes. The cart rolled toward the gates, and the world behind them kept on living, as if they had already died. The church called it protection, a way to keep women from sin. But sin, like breath, finds its way through any wall. And in time, even the holiest cloisters learned that silence does not erase desire. Inside, there were rules for everything. How to walk, when to kneel, when to look up, when to eat. The sisters learned that stillness was safety, and that obedience could feel like peace if practiced long enough. But the peace was a fragile illusion. It depended on forgetting their families, their names, their bodies. The older nuns taught the younger ones how to live without touch, how to pray until the ache subsided, how to confess thoughts before they became actions, and how to hide what could not be confessed at all. The church called it holiness, but historians now call it something else. A carefully engineered system of control, where isolation became virtue and suppression became salvation. It was the dark history beneath the golden crosses, the unseen foundation beneath every holy hymn. And yet, within those same walls, the very thing the church feared most, the stirring of human desire, continued quietly, invisibly, like roots growing beneath the stone floor. By the 14th century, Europe was dotted with thousands of convents. Some glittered with stained glass and patron saints. Others were damp, remote, barely warmed by a single hearth. But all shared the same heartbeat, a rhythm of confinement that echoed across generations. Visitors rarely entered. Men almost never did. And when they did, they walked through as if entering heaven's antechamber, not realizing that for those within, it felt more like purgatory. The architecture itself was designed for obedience. Walls too high to scale, corridors too narrow to walk two abreast, windows positioned just high enough to show hide. Chapter 2. The rules, silence, sin, and surveillance. There was a rule for everything, and then there were rules for the rules. The convent's breath was measured in obedience. The sisters did not speak without permission, did not move without purpose, did not even dream without fear. Their world was built on the belief that silence made the soul clean, but silence, like water, can drown as easily as it can purify. Each morning began with the same ritual: the bell, the line, the prayer, the voice of the abbess sliding over the words of scripture, steady as stone. They knelt, they rose, they knelt again, a choreography of devotion that left no room for thought or rebellion. Every gesture was a confession. Every glance could be a sin. The rules said a sister must not touch another except in acts of service. She must not linger in conversation, nor meet another's eyes too often. She must never laugh too freely. To laugh was to remember joy. To remember joy was to remember the body, and the body was the first thing to be tamed. Inside the medieval convent secrets, the body was enemy and instrument alike. Fasting kept the stomach weak, prayer kept the mind occupied, and exhaustion, that soft, trembling exhaustion, was the most reliable form of control. The sisters wrote these rules themselves. They believed the more they limited the flesh, the closer they came to the divine. But what they truly built was a labyrinth of guilt, a place where thought turned inward until it began to eat itself. The confessor came once a week, a man, cloaked in black, whose voice drifted through the screen like smoke. The sisters knelt before him one by one, their words trembling, their secrets half-formed. They confessed impure dreams, the warmth of another's hand during prayer, a wandering thought while reading scripture. Some cried as they spoke, not because of what they had done, but because they no longer knew what sin really meant. And the confessor listened, not always with mercy, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with hunger disguised as holiness. The church recorded everything. Each confession was written, copied, archived, their failures, a word spoken too loudly, a piece of bread taken too soon, a glance that lingered. Each offense was met with the same response, a nod, a note in the record, and sometimes the quiet phrase, "Do better." But shame was the true punishment. It stayed on the skin long after the ceremony ended. Even laughter after that sounded guilty, as though joy itself required permission. But when whispers spread, when two voices met too often in the garden, or when the light between candles revealed something that looked too much like affection, the punishment deepened. There were prayers to extinguish desire. There were vigils that lasted until dawn. And there were rooms, small, airless, built not for prayer, but for forgetting. In those rooms, time slowed. Bread and water came through a slit in the door. The rest was scripture, and the endless sound of your own breathing. It was said that after a week, a sister would confess anything, even love that had never been spoken. The church called it purification, but it was closer to erasure. This was the heart of the dark history, the careful balance between worship and surveillance. The church didn't need chains or flames. It had guilt, and guilt was a far more elegant prison. Still, within these walls of order and ritual, the forbidden persisted. The candlelight lingered too long on skin. Hands brushed in the passing of bread. Two hearts began to recognize each other in the rhythm of the same prayer. The rules could bind the mouth, but they could not silence the pulse. Every act of devotion carried a shadow. Every kneeling body became a quiet battlefield. And somewhere in that stillness, the forbidden desire in convents grew like ivy, thin, persistent, reaching for whatever light it could find. Some abbesses pretended not to see. They spoke of temptation as rain, inevitable but passing. Others punished harshly, believing holiness could be restored through suffering. But nothing truly disappeared. It simply learned to hide. The glances became shorter, the hands slower, the silence more deliberate. And through it, Chapter 3, The Confessions, Temptation Within Holy Walls. It begins quietly. It always does. A longer glance during evening prayer, a hand brushing another's sleeve in passing, a silence that feels too full, too heavy with something that has no name. In every convent, there came a season when devotion and longing began to sound alike. The sisters called it trial. The church called it temptation. But to the women who lived it, it was simply the heart remembering what the rules had tried to erase. The walls had taught them obedience, but the heart still listened for warmth. Even in the coldest cloister, something inside them reached toward the smallest flame. At first, they prayed harder. They doubled their fasting, slept on stone, kissed the cross until their lips bled, but the ache did not vanish. It only grew quieter, more disciplined, more dangerous. Among the medieval nuns, love could not be spoken, so it became a language of gestures, folded hands that lingered too long, a shared look during hymn, a small gift left by a bedside, each act innocent enough, until meaning bloomed inside it like ink spreading through cloth. There were stories whispered from convent to convent, of a sister who dreamed of another and woke crying her name, of two who confessed their love aloud and were never seen again, of one who tried to carve her feelings into parchment, only to burn the letter before dawn, terrified the ink itself might betray her. One record from 1376 tells of two sisters in Poitiers. They were found kneeling together after midnight, the moonlight cutting their silhouettes across the chapel floor. When questioned, neither spoke. They only held hands until the guards tore them apart. The next morning, one was sent to a distant house. The other was ordered to fast for 40 days. Weeks later, a psalter in the abbess's cell was found with a slip of parchment inside, a single line written in trembling Latin. "She prays for me. I pray for her. God will decide which of us he hears first." No one knew who wrote it, but the ink was still wet when they burned it. Historians later found confession too honest to retract. The church responded like fire. Records from the 13th century speak of penance for unnatural affection. Some were flogged, some imprisoned, some sent to other convents where even their names were changed. Yet the same records reveal how often it happened. The punishments repeated, the words copied again and again, as if sin itself had become a kind of routine. The priests called it corruption. The abbesses called it disease. But the sisters, they called it human. Even those who feared it most knew it could not be fully banished, because the line between divine love and earthly love was thinner than parchment. And sometimes, in the candle's low glow, they looked the same. The dark history of these walls was not only the cruelty of the church, but its blindness to beauty. It tried to separate spirit from flesh, as though the soul could live without a body. And in doing so, it taught the sisters how to love in silence so profound, it became sacred in its own way. There was another kind of confession too, the ones whispered to priests through latticed screens. A trembling voice admitting dreams, feelings, or touches that never meant harm. Some confessors listened with pity, others with fascination. Behind the screen, power shifted quietly. A woman's shame became a man's curiosity. Her secret became his weapon. Some priests used it gently, offering comfort that grew too close. Others used it cruelly, forcing obedience in exchange for absolution. It is in these small moments that weird history hides, where holiness bends into hunger, and power wears the mask of piety. Centuries later, church archives would downplay these scandals. The language changed. Spiritual friendship, misguided devotion. But between those phrases, the truth still breathes. The human heart refusing to die inside its own prison. Sometimes the sisters found peace in small rebellions. Singing too softly to be heard. Writing poetry in the margins of prayer books. Keeping pressed nights when the moon cut through the glass and the halls slept in perfect stillness. A sister might whisper a name. Not to heaven, not to be forgiven, but simply to remember that once she had been alive. And somewhere, deep in those cloisters, another name would answer. Not in words, but in breath, soft and steady, like prayer itself. Morning breaks too quietly. The air tastes of wax and sleep. The sisters rise, eyes lowered, their footsteps soft as dust. A breeze slips through the chapel, carrying the faint echo of last night's prayers. And something else. The scent of crushed petals lingers in the air. Someone has hidden flowers again, beneath the altar cloth. No one speaks of it, but every heart in the room knows who placed them there. Between faith and flesh, there is a silence no scripture names. It hums between ribs when the prayer turns to ache, when the soul whispers something the tongue cannot repeat. The sisters called it temptatio, temptation. But what they truly feared was not sin. It was recognition. For in the stillness of the convent, when the world beyond the gate was forgotten, they began to hear themselves, the rhythm of their own hearts, the heat of their own blood. And in that recognition, a flicker of shame, followed by something that felt suspiciously like truth. Some thought it was the devil's trick. Others believed it was God testing the boundaries of his own creation. But to those who lived it, it was neither light nor darkness. It was simply being human, and realizing how little the church allowed that to mean. At night, when the candles guttered out, some prayed harder, fearing that their thoughts might burn through the veil. Others lay awake in the dark, watching the faint outline of another's breathing, and wondered what it would feel like to touch the living without being condemned for it. A single sigh could undo a vow. A thought could summon an eternity of guilt. Chapter 4. The Runaways, Nuns who escaped and the price they paid. Not every vow held, not every wall worked, and sometimes, in the slow hours before dawn, a sound could be heard. Not the bell, not the chant, but the creak of a door that should never open. They called them runaway nuns. The phrase sounded almost absurd, as if holiness itself could flee on bare feet. But flee they did. Some left because of love, some because of hunger, some because they realized too late that the gate to heaven was also a prison door. The chronicles called them sinners, but those who lived behind the stone knew better. They were the ones who remembered what freedom smelled like. It began with whispers, two sisters trading glances during work, one mouthing words, "Tonight." They would hide a nail under straw, a sliver of bread inside a sleeve, a scrap of rope tucked behind the garden wall. The escape itself was almost always clumsy. Some said they drowned. Others swore they reached the sea and boarded a ship bound for Flanders. No one ever proved either. But years later, a letter arrived at the convent door, unsigned, bearing two words, "Still breathing." No one rehearsed rebellion. The habits tangled their legs, the rosary beads clinked like betrayal. They would move in silence, feeling their way along corridors lit only by moonlight leaking through stained glass. Every step a prayer, every heartbeat a threat. Outside, the world was colder than they remembered. The earth felt wrong beneath their feet, too open, too alive. For years, the walls had pressed around them like a second skin. Freedom burned against it like frostbite. Some made it to nearby woods. Some never left the courtyard. When guards discovered an empty cell, the abbess sounded the bell. Not for prayer, but for pursuit. Villagers were told to watch the roads. Runaways were described in sermons as thieves of faith. The church made examples of them, not for vengeance, but for order. The dark history of the escapes lies not in their failure, but in what happened when they succeeded. A nun who reached another town found herself nameless again, without a husband. Cut, so they might never whisper again. The Inquisition kept tidy notes. Runaways apprehended, repentance incomplete, discipline restored, the handwriting elegant, the meaning monstrous. Others vanished entirely, their names struck from every ledger, as if never born, never prayed, never existed. And yet, even erasure left traces. Letters survive, hidden in walls, buried under floorboards, found centuries later by masons repairing old cloisters. One fragment reads, "Do not pray for me, pray for those still inside." No signature, just the faint curve of ink shaped by trembling hands. There were rumors, too, of nuns who dressed as men, joined caravans, became healers or midwives, moving from village to village, leaving behind stories of strange women who prayed before every birth and wept afterward. Some of these tales became folklore, others became warnings. The church taught that runaways were cursed, that their shadows burned longer than their bodies. But villagers told different stories. Stories of women who appeared during storms, offering food to the lost, and vanishing before dawn. Faith and rebellion, sin and survival, the line between them blurred like mist over the fields. The church feared what they represented, a woman who belonged to no man, to no God, but her own choosing. That kind of freedom was heresy. It was scandal. It was contagion. So every church scandal that followed bore a familiar scent. A woman refusing to obey. A body refusing to kneel. Inquisitors called it moral rot. But the truth was simpler. It was memory. Memory of open sky, of laughter unchained, of the first breath taken without permission. And though most runaways were caught, though their punishments were brutal, something remarkable happened. They kept trying. Generation after generation, new sisters found hidden doors. New pairs of trembling hands pressed against the same locks. Even when the church rebuilt thicker walls, the desire for freedom slipped through like smoke. Freedom move, and somewhere, deep inside the convent, a lock clicks. Not loudly, just enough to be heard by anyone still awake, anyone listening for the sound of escape. Chapter 5. The Whispers. Rumors, ghosts, and strange miracles. After every storm came silence, but in that silence the whispers began. They moved softly through the corridors, not quite sound, not quite thought, something in between. The sisters called them warnings, the church called them lies, but no one truly knew where the first whisper came from. Some said it was the voice of the wind sliding through cracks in the stone. Others swore it was the prayers of runaways, echoing back from the fields, still searching for a home. In every convent across medieval times there were stories of candles that burned without wax, of tears that turned to salt on the floor, of hands felt on one's shoulder when no one was there. These tales lived longer than their tellers. They travelled from cloister to cloister, stitched together by rumour, woven through centuries like a shadowed tapestry. The church preferred miracles to hauntings, but both brought attention, and attention brought donations, so sometimes the line between heaven and hysteria was allowed to blur. A young nun in Cologne was said to bleed roses, another in Florence levitated during prayer. One abbess claimed her convent's bread never ran out, though the poor starved outside her gate. These were called proofs of holiness, but just as often they were masks for something else, for hunger, for illness, for grief so deep it needed wings. Behind the legend of miracles lurked stranger stories. A nun waking each night to find her crucifix turned upside down. Another hearing her own name whispered from inside the wall. Once, in a convent near Rouen, the sisters swore they saw a figure walking across the courtyard, a woman in white, barefoot, her veil wet with rain. When they called to her, she turned, and there was no face beneath the hood. They said it was a runaway returned, punished for her escape, condemned to walk until judgment. The priests came, they blessed the courtyard, they burned candles for 7 nights, and still the whispers did not stop. The medieval convent secrets were never written in ink. They were carried in air, in the soft trembling between vespers and dawn. Some sisters claimed to see the Virgin herself, but she came not in radiance, only in shadow, her face pale, her eyes cast of light. There were darker echoes, murmurs of nuns who faked miracles to cover forbidden births, of infants buried beneath gardens, their cries mistaken for ghosts, of confessions that went missing, and candles that refused to go out no matter how hard the sisters tried to snuff them. These are the pieces weird history seldom tells, not because they are false, but because they are too human. For every miracle proclaimed, there was a secret buried beneath it, and in that burial, truth decayed into myth. Still, the whispers endured. They spoke of doors opening by themselves, of veils that moved without wind, of letters found under pillows written in hands that no longer existed. Even the abbesses, proud in their certainty, grew uneasy. They forbade talk of ghosts. They punished superstition. But when the candles guttered at night, they too glanced over their shoulders. There was one story that spread across Europe, of a nun who had been walled alive. They said she broke her vow and conceived a child. When discovered, she begged for mercy. Instead, the abbess sealed her in a small room behind the chapel wall, leaving her a single slit for air and confession. For months, the sisters heard her prayers through the stone, then only silence. Years later, workmen repairing the chapel found the chamber empty. The chains rusted through, the wall cracked open. No bones, only a veil. The rumor spread like wildfire. The church denied it, of course, but it lived on, in lullabies, in the nervous laughter of novices when wind moved through the chapel. They said if you knelt by that wall at midnight, you could still hear her whisper, asking not for forgiveness, but for freedom. And perhaps that is why so many convents, even centuries later, felt haunted, because the ghosts that lingered there were not demons or angels. They were memories, memories of women who had lived, loved, broken their vows, and refused to vanish quietly. The church, desperate for order, recorded what it could. It called them cases of hysteria, possessions, signs of moral weakness. But between those lines of condemnation, you can hear something gentler, a trace of sorrow, a hint of awe, the uneasy recognition that faith could not cage the human heart. And so, the whispers continued, through winter storms, through plague. Chapter 6. The Inquisitors, Church Investigations and Public Scandals. By the late 14th century, the whispers grew too loud to ignore. Miracles had turned to murmurs, visions blurred with rumors. And so, the church sent its listeners, the Inquisitors. They did not come with swords. They came with parchment, seals, and questions. Always questions. At first, the sisters greeted them as holy men, keepers of order, guardians of faith. But faith was not what they sought. They came to measure obedience, to weigh silence, to find the fractures in stone. They arrived at dawn, their horses steaming in the cold. Black cloaks, ink-stained fingers, eyes that had read too much and believed too little. When the gate closed behind them, the convent seemed smaller. Even the air seemed to tighten. The abbess bowed, the sisters knelt, and the inquisitors began their work. Every medieval history record agrees. The questions were never simple. They began with devotion and ended with desire. Do you see visions? Do you hear voices at night? Has anyone touched you while you slept? Each question was a trap, and every answer became evidence. In one dim chamber, Sister Helena knelt before 3 men. A candle burned low between them. One asked questions. One took notes. The third simply watched. Did you ever feel warmth during prayer? Yes, Father. Was it divine or human? Silence. The inquisitor leaned forward. Answer carefully. Souls depend on it. Her hands trembled on the wooden rail. If I knew the difference, she whispered, perhaps I would not be here. The quill scratched once. Ambiguous. Some sisters confessed immediately, their faith trembling under the weight of fear. Others denied everything and were punished for lying. The church called it purification. The women called it judgment. Convents once known for prayer became theatres of inquiry. Every movement watched, every sigh recorded. The medieval convent secrets case came from Milan. A small convent, known for its quiet discipline, suddenly found itself accused of blasphemy. A merchant claimed he saw 2 nuns walking hand in hand in the cloister at midnight. One wore a crown of flowers, the other, a crucifix turned backward. The report reached the bishop within days. The inquisitors followed. Inside the walls they found nothing. No flowers, no crowns. But the rumor was enough to stain the air. The sisters were separated, questioned, confined. No torture was recorded, but sometimes cruelty doesn't need iron. A locked door and a candle burning too close can do the same work. Months later, one of the sisters was found lifeless, a small string of rosary beads clenched in her hand. The official record called it divine despair. The townsfolk called it something else. A tragedy, a cover-up. Another of the church scandals that everyone whispered about, but no one dared to name aloud. The inquisitors moved on. They always did. Faith was a ledger. They balanced it and left. Their reports still exist in dusty archives, pages dense with accusations, signed by hands that believed they were saving souls. And yet, between the lines you can feel it. The pulse of something human trying to survive. Some nuns fought back, not with weapons, but with words. In 1502, Sister Marguerite of Dijon wrote a letter to Rome, pleading for mercy for her convent. She described how fear had replaced prayer, how sisters confessed sins they had never committed, just to be left alone. Her letter ends with a line that chills across centuries. We no longer fear hell, Father. We live in it. The letter was never answered. What history records instead is the trial that followed. Marguerite was accused of pride. Her convent dissolved, its lands absorbed by a neighboring monastery. The inquisitors wrote, "Rebellion contained, heresy extinguished." But her words survived. Hidden in the margins of another nun's psalter, scribbled small, like a prayer meant only for the dead. These were not isolated stories, journal fragments hidden behind altar stones. A line here, a word there. Forgive me, not for my desire, but for my fear of it. And another. God made me feel warmth. They called it sin. These confessions are the true church scandals, not of lust, but of longing, not of flesh, but of humanity denied. The inquisitors believed they were saving purity. What they saved instead was silence. And silence, like stone, endures. But even stone cracks. And through those cracks, truth sometimes glimmers. In 1601, a chronicler in Lyon wrote, "The convent has gone quiet again. The inquisitors departed at dawn. The sisters sang at vespers. And though their voices trembled, it sounded like freedom. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. History doesn't tell us. It only leaves the echo. When night returns, the corridors are empty again. The ink on the inquisitors' pages dries. The smell of wax fades. But beneath the silence, you can still hear the faint scratching of quills. Writing names. Crossing them out. Writing them again. And in that rhythm of ink and erasure, you realize the investigation never truly ended. It only changed hands. Chapter 7. The Forgotten. Erasure, silence, and rewriting of records. When the inquisitors left, they took the noise with them. What remained was quieter and far more dangerous. Because silence is never empty. It is full of what cannot be said. In the years that followed, the convents began to edit themselves. Ledgers rewritten, names rearranged, margins trimmed away until nothing remained but virtue. The sisters called it cleansing. Rome called it correction. But what it truly was forgetting. A new hand entered the archives. A new ink. A new version of truth. Each convent received letters from the bishops, urging them to review their chronicles, to remove confusing or unnecessary detail. The dark history of miracles gone wrong, of forbidden friendship, of midnight cries, was to be erased, not denied, just softened. The process was slow, methodical, as all quiet forms of destruction are. First, the chronicles, then the correspondence, then the personal diaries, scraped clean with small knives, pages washed and reused for new hymns. There are books in the Vatican Library today where you can still see the ghost of older ink beneath the surface of psalms, the faint outline of names that once had stories. That's what forgetting looks like when done by hand. The medieval nuns who had spoken too freely were reassigned, transferred to remote houses, their records sealed. Those who had written, those who had dared to describe what life inside the cloister truly felt like, were declared spiritually unstable. A few were quietly buried, without marker or mention. The church didn't need to burn them. It only needed to misplace them. And so began the second conquest, not of flesh, but of memory. What could not be erased was rewritten. Letters became sermons. Confessions became lessons. A love note turned into a prayer. In time, even the sisters forgot what had been changed. History folded over itself like linen washed too often. Thin, fragile, pale. The medieval convent abbesses who ruled with mercy. A holy fiction so flawless it almost glows. But between those lines, if you look long enough, you can see the smudges. Tiny words written sideways, half-erased sentences that start and stop abruptly, like someone was interrupted mid-thought. It's there you find the real voices. The hesitation before obedience, the flicker of resistance. Medieval history calls it the Age of Faith. But faith, unrecorded, is not what endured. It was fear that lasted longer, because fear was taught to survive. For every miracle preserved, a story of suffering was lost. For every name canonized, a dozen were crossed out. The church built heaven on paper and left its ghosts in the margins. Somewhere in Germany, a nun named Clara wrote her final entry in the convent chronicle. They told me not to write what I have seen, so I write instead what I am told to see. Her ink fades into the next line, a hymn praising silence. The world outside never noticed. The towns went on. The bells kept ringing. Generations passed, believing the walls had always been pure. That's how rewriting works. It doesn't argue. It replaces. Even now, historians searching through archives find pages glued together, folios missing, whole years gone. Lost to fire, the curators say. But the burn marks are never there. What truly burned was memory itself. And still, some stories escaped, hidden in parish ledgers, in personal letters, in the footnotes of priests too tired to censor. These fragments, a sigh here, a plea there, are all that remain of those women. They are the bones of the forgotten, the relics of the erased. Sometimes, when you read them under candlelight, you can almost hear their breath between the words. They do not ask for revenge, only to be remembered as they were. Flawed, frightened, and human. The church called them silence. Chapter 8. Epilogue, Legacy and Reflection. Centuries have passed. The walls are ruins now. Moss covers the stones, and the sound of prayer has turned into wind. Yet even now, when night settles over the valleys of France or over the hills of Italy, you can still see the outlines of the convents, those sleeping skeletons of faith and fear. Their doors are open to no one. Their bells no longer ring, but their silence remains, steady as breath beneath the earth. The dark history that once hid behind veils and vows has not vanished, it has only changed form. In old archives you can find fragments, a single word burned into parchment, a cross drawn too quickly, a page torn away mid-prayer. Small gestures that say more than any decree. The medieval nuns who lived through it never meant to become symbols. They were not rebels, nor saints, nor stories. They were women trapped between holiness and hunger, yearning for something they could never name aloud. Some sought God, some sought love, some sought simply to be seen. And though the church erased their names, it could not erase the feeling they left behind. That soft rebellion of being human inside a world that demanded perfection. History likes to pretend it knows everything, but it only knows what was written. And what was written was chosen carefully. The rest, the tears, the laughter, the heat of forbidden hands, the breath caught between guilt and grace, was left for us to imagine. That is where the truth lives now, in the spaces between the lines, in the silences that history could not close completely. When you walk through those ruins today, you might think you hear the echo of a hymn. Centuries later, visitors wander those ruins. They step softly, as though the air itself remembers. Tour guides speak of architecture, of frescoes and faith. But those who linger after the crowd leaves say they feel something else. A hush that seems alive. A faint scent of wax, though no candles have burned there for ages. Sometimes, when the light fades through broken glass, it paints the walls gold again. For a moment, the ruin looks holy. And perhaps everything, and discovered he demanded even more. Some modern restorers claim that when they polish the old frescoes, faces appear beneath the paint. Eyes that were once erased, re-emerging faintly under the surface. Perhaps it's only a trick of pigment and time. Or perhaps the forgotten are trying, even now, to look back at us. One archivist in Florence described the moment she found a loose page inside a 14th century missal. It bore no saint's name, only a line written in delicate Latin. To be good is to be silent. To be silent is to vanish. She said she had to stop reading. Her hands trembled, because it no longer felt like history. It felt like a message, passed from one woman to another across 600 years. We like to think the past is gone, sealed, concluded, catalogued. But perhaps the past listens. Perhaps it waits for us to listen back. And maybe when we speak these stories aloud again, when we breathe their names softly into the dark, we give them the afterlife they were denied. For remembrance is its own resurrection. It does not raise bodies, but it revives meaning. And what is history, if not the long act of remembering what someone else tried to forget? The nuns may have been erased from ledgers, but they remain in us, in every question about obedience, in every ache that asks whether holiness and happiness were ever meant to coexist. So when you stand in those ruins, do not bow your head. Look up. See the light that filters through the broken roof. That light is older than any church, and kinder than any law. Let it fall on your hands, and remember, for every silence carved into history, there was once a voice that dared to speak first. And if we can still hear it, even faintly, then maybe not all prayers go unanswered. And maybe that's what makes this part of medieval history worth remembering. Not because it is holy, but because it is honest. The Church wrote of devotion. The sisters left behind devotion's shadow.
Final benediction. Now the voices fade. The bells have long stopped ringing, and the corridors where vows once echoed are filled only with dust and wind and memory. What remains is not the punishment, nor the prayers written under command. What remains is the quiet proof of longing, the kind that refuses to die, no matter how many walls were built around it. The dark history of those convents is not only about sin or scandal, it's about the shape of loneliness in a time that had no word for it. They called it temptation, they called it heresy, but perhaps it was only humanity, reaching out through candlelight, asking to be seen, to be known, to be loved. When you study medieval history, you find kings, crusades, and saints. But if you listen carefully, beneath the sermons and the Latin, you can hear something softer, a sigh, a heartbeat, a hand brushing another in the dark. That is the history that doesn't make it into textbooks. That is the history that lives between breaths. And that's why I tell it here, quietly, slowly, as the night folds over itself. Because not every story is meant to keep you awake. Some are meant to let you rest, to remind you that even sorrow, when spoken gently, can feel like peace. So if tonight's walk through these medieval convent secrets brought you a kind of calm, if it helped you understand how deeply human even the holiest lives once were, you're welcome to stay with me here, at Boring History for Sleep. This channel exists for the stories that time forgot, for the truths too fragile to shout, for the memories that survived in whispers. If you'd like, you can like this video or subscribe, not out of habit, but because you wish to keep wandering through the quiet side of history with me, only if it rests your mind, only if it helps the night settle. And in the comments, if you wish, leave a small hello. Tell me where you're listening from and what hour it is there. It's strangely comforting to imagine a circle of listeners, scattered, silent, yet breathing the same slow rhythm across the world. Here, no one is forgotten. Not the nuns, not the ghosts,